Just when we thought that the Middle East couldn't get any crazier, it gets even more insane this last week. So we're going to talk about a series of US strikes in Yemen. We're going to talk about an exchange of fire between Iran and Iraq and Pakistan. And we're also going to talk about a couple other stories as well that are follow-ups from previous stories that we've talked about or just brand new ones. All of that in this edition of the International Affairs News Roundup. On to the first story. First off, yes, things continue to heat up in the Red Sea, and the US is nearing the end of its patience with the Houthi group in Yemen. After a couple of months, really, of Houthi attacks on commercial shipping throughout the Red Sea, the US and the UK finally joined forces and launched a series of strikes on Houthi positions all around Yemen. And it happened on January 12th. However, there have been follow-up strikes ever since, continuing to target Houthi firing positions. Now, we've already talked about the Red Sea crisis a few times on this channel, but it's been a little bit since we've hit on it. So here's a quick recap for those of you that have missed out. First off, the Houthis are a group out of Yemen that had previously fought a war against Saudi Arabia and has significant backing from Iran. They were designated as a terrorist organization at the very end of the Trump administration. However, they were unlisted as a terrorist organization in the beginning of the Biden administration, only for them to now be relisted by the Biden administration as a terrorist organization. Some of those sophisticated capabilities that they've received from Iran include anti-ship ballistic missiles, which allow them to target any kind of ship in the Red Sea. Since the war in Gaza began, the Houthis announced that they were on the side of Palestine and they would be targeting any ship belonging to Israel. However, in practicality, what we've seen is that they're targeting really anything, up to and including now at this point ships belonging to the United States. And they've targeted these ships with attempted hijackings, some of which have actually been successful, and with attempted sinkings with anti-ship ballistic missiles. This whole crisis has caused some of the world's largest commercial shipping companies to reroute their ships around Africa instead of through the Suez Canal and through the Red Sea. Mind you, the Red Sea before the war was one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. So this has led to between 8 to 12 days in extra shipping time, as well as millions of dollars in extra shipping costs per ship. And if you remember back to COVID, the impact on the supply chain that had, this is going to have a similar kind of impact. However, we may not feel it for another week or month or so, but we will feel it for weeks and months. Now, the catalyst for these strikes by the US and the UK on the Houthis was really these routine attacks on civilian shipping. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak basically re-emphasized the importance of these strikes, saying that they were proportional and limited. And similarly, US officials stated that these attacks on commercial ships would not be tolerated. Since these strikes, however, the Houthis have decided to continue to mess around and potentially find out by continuing to target civilian ships as well as some US flagged ships. Now, while the US and the UK are involved in striking the Houthis, the involvement of other countries has really been pretty varied. We've talked about how China has taken the sit this one out and watch and eat some popcorn strategy, while countries like the Netherlands, Australia, Canada, and France have all had pretty limited to no real response in general. Iran, however, has continued support for the Houthis, vowing escalation if the Houthis were to be targeted in any significant capacity. Now, I think it's fair to say that the Houthis are deep in their mess around and find out stage. However, given the limited US response up to this point and how long it took the US to respond to these strikes, I think that they might feel slightly emboldened in their strategy and might not see any problems with just continuing its attack. And they understand how risk averse that Western countries typically are to escalating in a conflict. And so they might seek to exploit that by continuing to target civilian ships, basically playing a game of chicken with the United States, which is a risky endeavor because historically you might see some cases where the US might choose to back down, but really most of the time what you're going to see is they're not, and that's not going to end particularly well for a group like the Houthis. That said, there are also risks with letting a group like the Houthis continuing these actions unabated. Keep in mind that they are a non-state actor, they're a terrorist group, and while they have sophisticated capabilities, they are still a non-state actor. There are other non-state actors in the world that either have these capabilities as well or want these capabilities for themselves. And so how you deal with the Houthis will impact the risk calculus that these other groups have and what they decide to do in other parts of the world. And yes, some of those other parts of the world happen to also include very important shipping lanes. So all that to say, what's done with the Houthis will set a precedent for other groups. Clearly so far, it says something that the Houthis have continued their strikes despite the US airstrike campaign, and that it seems like the Houthis are going to just kind of continue anyway. Now, whether we're watching a prolonged air campaign over Yemen or something a little bit more limited, I guess time will just tell. However, if the Houthis are firing from prepared and even reinforced firing positions, meaning that, they can move their rocketry and missiles underground if they have to, that might really impact the length of this air campaign and the effectiveness. However, so far it appears that this air campaign is primarily focused on taking out those anti-ship ballistic missiles. However, this crisis in the Middle East doesn't just expand in the Red Sea and with the Houthis, it's really heated up in other parts, and that takes us to Iran. Iran launched ballistic missile strikes in Iraq, Syria, and Pakistan, and that has made things way more complicated. Of course, this follows the ISIS bombings last week that we discussed during the anniversary of the Qasem Soleimani killing. Iran decided to respond with a series of ballistic missile strikes in Syria, targeting what they said was an ISIS camp, as well as in Erbil, Iraq, which targeted what they also said was an ISIS facility and a Mossad spy facility, but what was also happened to be the house of a wealthy Iraqi businessman. They also attacked an area in Baluchistan and in Pakistan where they claim to have been targeting a separatist group. However, in all of these strikes, civilians were killed. What's more is that these strikes weren't done with a proxy. They were literally done by the IRGC directly from Iranian territory, and the IRGC took direct responsibility, which is a tremendous step up from previous behavior that we've seen. Now, I want to state up front that, despite some reporting from some folks that no U.S. bases or facilities appear to be targeted in this attack, however, it really doesn't help that civilians were killed either way. Now, all but the Syrian government condemned the attacks. Really, Syria and Iran have a close relationship, so they probably understood. However, Iraq and Pakistan don't necessarily have that kind of relationship, so they both summoned the ambassadors. And while Iraq so far hasn't really done anything, and we'll see if Iraq even can do anything, Pakistan, however, did do something. They launched an airstrike within Iran, somewhere within 50 kilometers inside of Iran, targeting another Baluchistan separatist group. There were some rumors that that area also happened to have an IRGC base. However, civilians were killed in that strike as well. That I remember, I believe this is the first time that we've seen Iran launch ballistic missiles anywhere else in the Middle East directly from Iran, at least since the 2021 retaliation for the Qasem Soleimani killing, where they did deliberately target a U.S. base. However, this time, while they didn't target any U.S. bases, they are saying that they did target Mossad. I say that that's important because with the escalating crisis in the Red Sea and the escalating tensions between Israel and Hezbollah, as well as the deteriorating situation for Hamas and Gaza, seeing that Iran is willing to put their name towards strikes and target outside of Iran deliberately by themselves without the use of proxies, that kind of does say something that they are willing to get involved and get their hands dirty if necessary. And while I say that, it doesn't really help that ISIS decided to involve themselves in this situation either, because they don't really have any friends. I think we can all agree that they're bad and they can go away. However, kind of like World War II, it's like who takes care of them and how does that post-enemy world look like? We could let Iran just go crazy on ISIS. However, at the same time, that might give them a position to dictate the terms of the post-conflict Middle East. And is that a good idea? I mean, it's not like we, the United States, have done a terribly good job ourselves, so, I'll let you decide. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. We've seen the Middle East explode with instability before, and if you remember back to the Arab Spring, it was just absolute pandemonium. You had multiple regimes dealing with complete domestic upheaval. You had the rise of ISIS, and you had the wars that followed that spanned large chunks of the Middle East. And that really led to high-intensity conflict in multiple places all around the region. And that conflict has countries like Syria and Iraq that really have not recovered. That said, since the Israel-Hamas war kicked off, we're really seeing a new high watermark of tensions and instability in the region. At least we could. Because not only are we dealing with non-state actors that have advanced capabilities to disrupt the global economy, we're looking at nation states that have beef with each other that might be willing to throw down at any time. And while whenever I was writing the script for this video, it looked like it was just going to be, a conflict area spanning Israel to Iran, which is still a pretty big area, we might actually be looking at potentially a conflict area spanning from the Mediterranean to Pakistan, which is nuts. And that's not to say that Pakistan would for sure get involved in a conflict. I mean, this might have just been a tit-for-tat pair of strikes. If, say, Iran doesn't strike Pakistan again, I'd be kind of surprised if Pakistan struck Iran out of nowhere. But at the same time, if they do kind of continue to go back and forth, then that could kind of pose some problems, considering especially that Pakistan is a nuclear power. And with all of that going on, there are millions and millions and millions of people that are caught in the crossfire. and that's not great. Consider the refugee crisis that the war in Syria kicked up and how Russia and Belarus exploited that crisis to ship refugees all around and target Poland and the Baltic states by putting pressure on their borders. That's in addition to just a general refugee crisis that Europe has struggled to handle. Having a gigantic war all throughout the Middle East is not going to resolve the refugee crisis in the short term. Maybe it will in the longer term by ultimately creating a sense of stability that lasts for a while that would allow people to feel safe to come home, but at the same time, history hasn't really shown that that's what's going to happen. Now, with all of that being said, Iran is not just feeling emboldened, they are being emboldened. That leads us to a new agreement between Russia and Iran. Russia and Iran are on the verge of signing a new strategic treaty. And this treaty, which is soon to be agreed upon between the Iranian president and Vladimir Putin, is expected to be signed soon. Now, the exact details of this treaty have not yet been disclosed. However, it's understood that it will encompass military and economic partnerships. In recent years, the relationship between Russia and Iran has become way more transactional and back and forth. And both of them have been able to derive mutual benefit from cooperation. And thus far, a lot of this cooperation has really manifested itself with technological and military agreements, especially with the war in Ukraine, where Iran has helped donate conventional weaponry such as drones and missiles to Russia. And in return, Russia has given Iran both money and its own technology such as jets. Now, something that they both have in common is that they are both under significant economic pressure from the West, both under significant amounts of sanctions, and they both have significant security concerns going on. For instance, Russia's got the war in Ukraine, and Iran has this current crisis going on in the Middle East. And unfortunately for them, neither have a very long list of friends. Both of their friend lists includes China, which has decided to sit a lot of this out and really just kind of observe because they don't really want to ostracize the West, which their economy really heavily relies on. So really that has forced Iran and Russia to draw closer together. Iran's not the only country that Russia has really sought a closer partnership with. They've also gone to North Korea and have been able to get relief and ammunition from North Korea. However, with all this being said, I'd be surprised if we started seeing Russian troops fighting it out in the Middle East, and I'd be surprised to see Iranian troops fighting it out in Ukraine. They've both got their own problems to focus on. And this all may impact the war in Ukraine, as Russia might be able to get more material from Iran, and that really takes us to the next story. I saw an update pop up that I really had to kind of give a double take and really do some additional digging on, because initially I kind of misunderstood what it was talking about, but now I think I figured it out, so let's discuss it. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is open to a peace summit hosted by Switzerland. And of course, Switzerland, classic, known for its neutrality, is open to hosting. Now, Zelensky's peace plan, which was announced at the G20, calls for a restoration of Ukraine's territory up to its previous borders, as well as the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine, and the release of all prisoners and detainees that Russia has taken so far. And this was all announced during the World Economic Forum in Davos, where Zelensky emphasized the role of China, one of Russia's key partners, as a key cog in helping to generate a peace agreement. And while he noted that Beijing can play an important role in this, he noted that Ukraine really cannot control the pace of this peace process. It's important to note that previous frameworks and plans of a similar type to this have been outright rejected by Russia. For instance, the Kremlin outright dismissed that this peace process will be that productive, since Russia will likely not be a party to this peace discussion. And while the peace details have not yet been clarified, it's still up in the air whether or not Russia will be a party to this peace summit. And if they're not going to be there, which they're probably not, I'm not going to lie to you, then this probably will not bring about a meaningful end to the conflict. Both Russia and Ukraine saw vast differences in what their idea for peace should look like in Ukraine. While Ukraine wants all of its territory back and Russia kicked out of Ukraine, Russia wants the territory that it's already annexed to remain Russian. Now, while fighting in the front line has really kind of continued to keep up, however, the movement of the front line has slowed down. Both sides will likely continue to generate combat strength for more fierce fighting in 2025, where either side might seek to gain extra territory. Now, we talked last week about Putin's potential interests in a peace agreement. However, again, consider the differences in how both Russia and Ukraine want that peace agreement to look like. Those aren't really small disagreements. Simply put, we'll see what happens. because at face value, it does not look like anything's really going to happen, but hey, we'll see and we'll follow up in a later video if need be. Now, speaking of issues with Russia and Chinese involvement, let's talk about the running issue of Russian sanctions and their impact on the Russian economy. Since 2022, Russian sanctions have had a mixed impact on the Russian economy. While they have been aimed at Russia's military capabilities, Russia has still clearly been able to keep up in its war with Ukraine, and their economy has shown a strong degree of resilience. Now, key factors towards this resilience include Russia's large economic reserve, as well as its ability to reroute energy resources from the West to other countries, as well as internal fiscal policies to stabilize the economy. However, the sanctions have created some challenges. For instance, they've isolated Russian banks from the global financial system, impeded the country's ability to get advanced technologies, which has had an important effect in Russian technological capability, and has led to a withdrawal of major foreign financial institutions from the Russian economy. And all of these factors have led to increased inflation of the ruble. Now that takes us to China, which has had a hand in helping Russia kind of evade some of these sanctions up to this point. And that's been done by financial transactions and certain other economic agreements between Russia and China. However, all of this may be coming to an end. Recent developments indicate that Turkish banks have actually started to close down the relationships with Russian banks, and that this behavior has also extended into China, and this is all due to the threat of US secondary sanctions, meaning that anybody that's helping Russia evade sanctions will themselves face sanctioning. Now, this move includes the halting of support for the Russian mirror payment system. That's a system that Moscow has used to basically try to replace or replicate the global credit card system. The US warned that any Turkish banks that were continuing to use and support the mirror payment system would face secondary sanctions, up to and including being banned from the use of the US dollar. Chinese banks have also faced similar pressure and are also starting to take similar activities to close the loopholes in sanctioning. Obviously, China wants to walk the tightrope between maintaining its close relationship with Russia while also not completely devastating its economy, which is largely reliant on the United States and other Western countries. Sanctions have played a key role in American power globally, specifically as a tool of limited engagement with regimes where basically physical conflict is off the table, but pressure still needs to be applied. So countries like Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, and Russia have all faced significant sanctioning packages, and you can look at their economy to see the types of effects that those sanctions have had. However, there can be key gaps within the sanctioning scheme, which now we're seeing that some of those gaps, at least with Russia, are being closed. Now, that all might pose some complications for China diplomatically with its relationship with Russia and its economic situation. However, there's another key development with China that also needs to be addressed. And that's because Lai Cheng-Te with the DPP won Taiwan's election, and Lai Cheng-Te will now be the president of Taiwan. And this is likely to make China very upset. Now, we've already talked about this last week and really the stance of all the different candidates, but for a quick refresher, Lai views China unfavorably. He believes in Taiwanese independence, and while he does want a dialogue with China, he will seek diplomatic relationships with countries like the United States to ensure Taiwanese independence. Under Lai's leadership and under the DPP, Taiwan will likely continue its distinct identity from China, and really none of this is something that China wants to hear right now. China has repeatedly expressed its intention to unify with Taiwan, and while they have stated that they would prefer it to be a peaceful unification, they have stated that they will use force if necessary. The increasing Chinese military activity around Taiwan also says something, which has included fighter jets and naval ships patrolling around Taiwan. The US, however, has maintained its position of strategic ambiguity around Taiwan, meaning that no one will really know whether or not the US would go to war to defend Taiwan or not. In recent years, the US has increased naval transits around Taiwan, and there have been discussions of a free trade agreement between the US and Taiwan, as well as US military aid directly to Taiwan. So what does all of this really mean? Well, we've seen the Chinese drills around Taiwan, we've seen the increasing rhetoric, and we've seen that this election is going to have a significant amount of consequences for Chinese-Taiwan relations. So while we're probably not going to see China hit the big red button tomorrow, it definitely does increase pressure on China to make a decision, whether or not it will do so militarily or just wait till the next election to act. However, that being said, we'll just have to continue to wait and see. So with all that being said, those are the stories for this week. And if you have anything that you want to discuss from any of the stories, let the comment hit down below. I want to note that last week I made a bit of an oopsie agency. I said that it was pancreatic cancer with Secretary Lloyd Austin. It was actually prostate cancer. I just kind of mixed it up and totally missed it in the edit, so that's on me. But with all that being said, like this video if you found it helpful or informative. Let me know your thoughts down below, and until next time.